Over the years, friends and family have asked if I'd ever thought about writing a memoir. Well, I'm flattered, but I'm not the memoir writing sort of chap. Then I thought I could do a series of videos, couldn't I? Not about my life, which is a bit too grand and self-congratulatory, but I could do it about some of the people I've met, from the saintly Mother Teresa, who was a family friend, to Albert Speer, Hitler's architect, who was definitely not a family friend. And then as I thought about it more and more, I began to remember things I'd tucked away. So I think I'll look back on major events that have affected my, and actually your life as well. So here goes. In bite-sized pieces, I present Not a Memoir. We'll begin at the beginning, the very beginning, with Grandad Stephen and India, the state of West Bengal, and the city of Calcutta, my hometown. Beginning in 1692, as a cluster of tiny villages and mud huts, standing amidst marshy land, paddy fields and jungles, in the course of 2.5 centuries, Calcutta developed into a mighty city of more than 4 million people. Once Calcutta had been called a city of palaces, luxurious houses built by the British, with gardens sweeping down to the river. But as you can see, by 1947, the year I was born, it had fallen into disrepair. It was congested, noisy, and chaotic. So how on earth did I get myself born in Calcutta? I was always told, and it was the family tradition, that the Robinsons came from the north of England. In fact, I've done my research, and it turns out that my grandfather, Stephen James Robinson, comes from Edinburgh. I guess that's right, because the northern Scottish border kept moving backwards and forwards. So you could have been the Robinsons of the north of England one year, and the Robinsons of the south of Scotland another. I traced my grandfather through his Masonic documents. Why the Masons? Well, the Masons played an important part in the British Empire. They raised the money and funded and enlisted men in Scottish regiments. The English may have administered India, but to be sure it was the Scots who provided the muscle. The East India Company caused my grandfather Stephen to end up in India. It was the biggest, most profitable multinational corporation the world has ever seen. And slowly it was revealed as more powerful than the British state itself. Imagine 8 people sitting round a boardroom table in Leadenhall Street in London, ruling over 24% of the world's landmass. That's 412 million people. In India, their misrule ended in the violent Indian Mutiny of 1857. It's also known as the Sepoy Rebellion and the First War of Independence. The rebellion was brutally suppressed, but it resulted in the British government realizing that the company had to be controlled, which meant the British government took over the enterprise by an Act of Parliament in 1874, and direct rule from Westminster began. So the British government now had to replace the East India Company Army and the East India Company Navy, by the way, larger than the British Army, larger than the Royal Navy, with British troops, and that's where Grandad Stephen comes in. He was a lowly cog in the machine. He arrived at the port of Madras in southern India with his regiment, ready for action, just in time to miss all the fighting. His regiment was disbanded, and he, like hundreds of other unemployed soldiers, set about finding jobs. He moved inland to a place called Lallguda, near Hyderabad, where he joined the fast-expanding Indian Railways. He was an engine driver. This is a good time to pause and talk about the delicate subject of race. At first, the British settlers were encouraged to marry local girls. For one thing, English girls were considered too fragile to survive in tropical conditions. But the children of mixed marriages, Anglo-Indians, children of British men and Indian women, began to be educated in the best schools in Britain, and as they also had a stake in their home country, India, they became a formidable ruling class. And this disrupted the British elite's plan. They visited India for 5 or 10 years, did business, made as much money as they could, and then returned home wealthy men. People of mixed race were prohibited from being appointed to top jobs, and they were relegated to the lower branches of the civil service, the army, the police, and the railways. But Grandad Stephen, being an insular Scot, bucked the trend and married a fellow Scot. The Scottish community in Lallguda was pretty large. The MacDonalds, the Camerons, the MacLeans, and my grandmother's group, the Mulcahy's and the Orrs. Grandad Stephen married Evelyn Ann Orr, and they had 2 children, my Auntie Kitty and my father, who was born on the 4th of November 1904. And true to Scottish form, even his godfather was Scottish, named McCarty, as you can see here on this certificate. I never knew my grandfather Stephen, but I did know Evelyn Ann Orr. She was to me Nan. She and Grandad Stephen juggled her work as a nurse and his driving trains. They were so remote in Lallguda that various Christian pastors and priests took it in turns to visit their community just every few months. When a baby was born, it was baptized or christened Catholic, Anglican or Methodist, depending upon whose turn it was to show up. So Dad was Catholic, his sister was Methodist. Though the markets were always full of food, she and Grandpa Stephen had a small holding, and they raised chickens for eggs and meat, cows for milk, and goats and pigs. Of course, they had servants to help them. It was a difficult environment. There were tigers and panthers at large, and the biggest hazard to farming was snakes, boa constrictors and pythons who preyed on the calves and the goats. In the early 50s, she used to visit us every Christmas. She came down from Lallguda, where she still worked as a nurse. And I can remember particularly her brutal baths. Now, I know she was a nurse and she was into a lot of hygiene, but my goodness, it was eye-watering. She also loved the theatre, and she took me to see once a chap called Tom Two Arrow, who was an Iroquois Indian doing a one-man show and touring India. And would you believe I found him on the net? And it reminds me that it was one of the first times I felt really embarrassed sitting in a theatre. I didn't know how loud my voice was, and right in the middle of this dance, I said very loudly, "Hey Nan, you can see his bum," which caused a ripple of laughter throughout the audience and a really filthy stare from Tom Two Arrow.
When the saints go.
It was also Nan who took me to the Lighthouse Cinema to see the Danny Kaye movie, The Five Pennies, when it first came out.
Danny Kaye stars as jazz legend Red Nichols in this true story of one man's struggle to build a career and a family.
Exciting enough, but when the film ended, no one left the theatre. And a man came out in front of the curtain and said, "You've seen the movie. Now, ladies and gentlemen, live on stage, the real Red Nichols and his 5 pennies." And there they were. I think it's that moment that I was hooked on music. And this is Protul Chandra Shaka. I remember him because when she took me to see him one Christmas, she fell down in the intermission and broke her arm. So she sailed away to England and lived her last years in an old people's home and is buried in Cheltenham. So that's the first leg of the Robinson family journey from Edinburgh to Lallguda. And next time, I'll talk about my dad, who went from this back of beyond railway settlement to become somebody very important in the big city. And also the tragic events of 1946 that changed my family's future forever.